Hello, everyone. This is Chip Boaz, and today on the Jazz Lowdown, I'm going to be asking a question that was inspired by my discussion about the Newport Jazz Festival last week. And my question to you is, does genre even matter anymore?
No.
Hey, Ken, hold on. I wasn't talking to you. I'm just trying to start a hypothetical conversation.
Doesn't matter. I'm right.
Okay, whatever. Despite what Mr. G thinks, I think this is an important question to ask in today's modern musical world. We live in a day and age where anything and everything is accessible to us just by picking up our cell phones. We can listen to music from any place, any time, or any musical lineage. We can get influences, we can steal licks, we can take ideological approaches, or simply just mimic the musicians that we see and hear. And on top of all that, just a quick search on YouTube will probably find us a tutorial that'll tell us how to take that and apply it to our instruments. That's pretty amazing. And that's just the beginning. Digital recording and technology at large has allowed us to manipulate music in ways that we never could have imagined decades ago. We can take recordings and speed them up or slow them down. We can isolate specific instruments from a recording and move them somewhere else. We can sample phrases or even just sounds of an instrument and then trigger them on another instrument that we are able to play in a familiar way. If you think about it, we can play sounds from anywhere on the planet without ever learning how to play those different instruments. That's pretty powerful. You know, in the 21st century, we are not limited by genre or anything else for that matter. We can cut and paste musical ideas just like they were words on a dock.
See, I told you. I'm right. We're done here.
No, we're not done here. In fact, we're just getting started. Because believe it or not, I disagree with Mr. G. I think genre matters, and I think it matters deeply.
Liar!
Okay, I'm going to dig a little deeper here, but I'd like to know your thoughts on this too. Do you think genre matters in the 21st century? Let me know. Tell me down in the comments your thoughts, and let's have a discussion about this. And please, can somebody just mute Mr. G for a little bit? When we're talking about genre and the need to preserve it, I think that we're actually talking about something else. We're talking about language. When musicians learn to play jazz, or any other genre for that matter, they're not just learning how to move their fingers on an instrument, they're learning how to speak a language. Now, I want to stop for a second and separate this idea about language associated with the genre from the idea of music as a universal language. Because, yes, it is true. Everyone can hear pitches, feel rhythms, and connect with music without saying a word. People can connect with any style of music without understanding it, studying it, or even attempting to play it. And musicians, since they have a lot of common foundations, can often get together and play, even if they come from two opposing musical worlds. That's a different truth, though, and a different concept of language. For a musician, there are specific ways to approach melody, harmony, rhythm, and phrasing within a genre that makes the music sound like that specific genre. When you approach those elements in a different way, it doesn't sound like that same bit of music anymore. Now, jazz has its own language, as does classical music, rock, salsa, or any other musical tradition that you could imagine. If you want to play in those genres, you have to understand how the musicians in the history of that music have approached melody, harmony, rhythm, and phrasing. Now, this doesn't mean that musicians can't cross pollinate and explore different genres without being completely versed in them. Musicians get together and play music from different backgrounds and languages. That's where the universal part of music comes into play. They can learn new bits of language from each other and develop something new that is reminiscent of both languages, but not quite the same. And in fact, this can be a very cool thing to inspire musical innovation and spur the growth of new musical genres for potentially exciting new products. There's so much potential there. And in my opinion, this should totally happen. But that's different. Both musicians are coming from a place where they're fluent in the language of their genres before they start experiment with genre bending. Two things happen when they do this. First, they create something that is authentically connected to the genres that they started with. Now, this may be a subjective opinion on my point, but I do think that that leads to music with more substance and meaning. The next thing that happens is if they're done experimenting and genre bending, they can go back to the original genres that they started with and play that music with accuracy and depth. They already speak the language, so they can go back and play with musicians that also speak it. And think about this. Here's a bonus. They're bilingual at this point, so they can go back and forth between these two settings. To me, that's the true beauty of genre blending. Something where we start from the past and build upon it to create something new that holds on to the past and leads to the future. We don't lose our history, but we gain a new musical direction. When we don't speak these languages and we just genre bend without much thought or care or knowledge to make it happen, it just becomes something kind of shallow, in my opinion. Now, we've seen this in action throughout history, so let's take a look to where this has happened before and see what happens when musicians genre bend, but they're coming from a point where they speak the language, and musicians who genre bend without speaking the language. The band Weather Report was formed in 1970 by keyboardist Joe Zawinul and saxophonist Wayne Shorter. Having both spent time playing with trumpet player Miles Davis during his seminal fusion era, they were both really interested in the idea of mixing the aesthetics of jazz and rock. But they were building upon something deeper. Zawinul had spent extensive time playing with hard bop pioneer Cannonball Adderley, and before that, vocalist Dinah Washington. Shorter had spent years playing with Miles Davis in his classic 60s quintet, as well as Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers, not to mention his own string of jazz albums under the Blue Note label. Both of these musicians were starting in a place where they spoke the language of jazz fluently. The group started in a similar place as Davis's groups of the late 60s, exploring experimental improvisational approaches with electric instruments. But as Zawinul dove deeper into synthesizers and electronics and checked out more modern rock, funk, and R&B musicians, the band moved in that direction. but they never lost sight of their jazz roots. No matter how funky the grooves got, you could also hear the concrete connection to the language of jazz. Weather Report, along with groups like Returned Forever and Herbie Hancock's Headhunters, fused jazz and rock based on their fluent command of the jazz language and their interest in rock. It was amazing and vibrant, and for a generation of young musicians, it was extremely inspiring. For some musicians, it was a gateway drug into jazz. For some, they dug into that music and learned to speak the language. Some of them became jazz musicians in a traditional context, while others learned the language and continued on in a fusion direction. Yet, as fusion became more a part of the musical landscape, other musicians used fusion as a starting point and didn't go back to the source. They still moved the music forward, but it led us into a confusing and somewhat paltry direction called smooth jazz.
Oh, yeah.
No. Since these musicians didn't have a jazz foundation to build upon, they took the instruments and basic aesthetics of the music, instrumental melodies and solos, to build their own version of fusion. I'm sure there were commercial influences as well, but these musicians were coming from a point where they were more connected to popular music than they were to the jazz tradition. Now, jazz is a music that requires study and knowledge, and without that, the music became instrumental pop music. Now, it might not be my favorite music in the world, but I'm going to say it. There's nothing wrong with smooth jazz musicians creating instrumental pop music. In fact, there's definitely a place for that in the world, as evidenced by the popularity of smooth jazz. The problem here is the jazz in the name. Not to get hung up on linguistics, but for so many people, especially in the 80s and early 90s, smooth jazz was jazz. Fortunately, we had advocates like Wynton Marsalis working tirelessly to make sure that the world knew the jazz tradition. But without that, we were on a course to losing jazz as a genre. That would have been tragic. So, I'll say it again. Does genre matter in the 21st century? And I say absolutely. As musicians, we need to understand the foundations upon which we're trying to make music in order to give our art substance and style. At the same time, I'll ask, is cross-pollination and genre bending important? And I'll say absolutely. But I'll include my caveat here. It needs to be done from a respectful and informed place. We have so many tools at our disposal now to simply grab and use musical ideas without ever understanding them. There's power in that. In fact, there's kind of a scary amount of power in that. But there's also a big danger where we risk losing our history and huge swaths of musical culture. So I want to know, what do you think about genre in the 21st century? Do you think it's important? Do you think that musicians should learn genres before blending them? Or should musicians just take whatever sounds that they like? Let me know down in the comments. This is going to be a really fascinating discussion, and I can't wait to hear what you have to say. If you're enjoying the conversation and want to catch everything as we move into the future, please hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications so that we can keep this conversation going. Thanks for hanging out with me today, folks, and I'll see you again here soon.